Number 10. Ray Romano. While listening to Ray Romano's voice for hours on end may be one of the harshest punishments ever conceived. Seriously, I wouldn't want to do that. What I was actually referring to was his portrayal of the woolly mammoth in Ice Age. Yes, the large tusked beast of the forgotten era. They were tough, and if crossed would surely spell the end of any Neanderthal brave enough to face one alone. Which I'm sure at some point was. Cause trouble in the tribe? Well, then you have to bring us dinner, and we're hungry, so please go single-handedly and hunt and bring back a woolly mammoth. I couldn't even imagine. Unfortunately for those Neanderthals, this isn't Star Wars, and they weren't Boba Fett. Bringing back the head of a beast single-handed wasn't going to happen. They were most likely going to get trampled, and left for archaeologists left to find thousands of years later. Yeah, no thanks. Number 9. Cliff. While the Neanderthals might not have been as smart as their Homo sapien counterparts, they were not exactly idiots. You find a high enough cliff, and you push said banished member off the cliff. It's simple, but effective. There's a good chance that whomever gets pushed off said cliff will not cause trouble for the tribe any longer. This is something that many civilizations would do for many years. The Greeks, the Romans, just about everyone really. You can't blame them either. It's cheap and quick, and if the cliff or ledge is high enough, you don't ever have to worry about cleaning up. Although I wouldn't do it in a pit like the Spartans. That would just fill up too quickly. And no shot that was the first time that Leonidas kicked a dude in the pit, let's be honest. Is there someone who empties the hole later? Cliffs are just easier. Just easier. Number 8. Ear infections. Okay, not exactly a punishment, but it could be a punishment from up above. Hear me out. Not exactly sure who did this to the Neanderthals. Maybe it was God, maybe it was evolution, maybe it was something else. But the Neanderthals were cursed with something that I don't ever want to experience again. Shout out to the people who don't want to put their head underwater, because after about 5 hours, the bonfire on the beach isn't so fun with your friends because you have an ear infection. Yes, that's right, ear infections. I'm sure I just described someone's least favorite summer night. Well, according to a study in 2019, ear infections were common in Neanderthals and may have ruined many meals by the fireside. While humans like us eventually grow out of them due to our ears' insides growing larger as we grow older, the inside of Neanderthals' ears stayed small and were a perfect place for bacteria. And like most folks, you're not you when you're hungry. You're also not you if you can't hear the Arctic monkeys playing by the bonfire because of a really bad ear infection. Honestly, if you ever had one, I'm just sorry.
At number 7, ownership. In ancient Rome, slavery and slave ownership was such a common practice that pretty much everyone owned slaves, regardless of social status. Even some of the poorest Roman citizens would own 1 or 2 slaves. Obviously, the more money you had back then, the more slaves you could afford. In Roman Egypt, the average artisan owned about 2 or 3 slaves each. Emperor Nero was known to have owned over 400 slaves who lived and worked in his home in the city, but his numbers are eclipsed by a wealthy Roman named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, who according to historical records owned 4,166 slaves at the time of his death. That just gives you an idea of just how many people were sold into slavery in the first place. At number 6, freedom. Earlier I mentioned that Roman slaves had the chance to buy their freedom. It was a lengthy process, but this gave a lot of slaves hope for a better life. Things weren't always better after buying their freedom though, and many of them sold themselves back into slavery because things were tough. The process of buying your freedom as a slave was called manumission. This could be achieved in a number of ways. Slave master could grant their slave freedom as a reward for their service and loyalty. The slave could pay their master a sum of money to be freed, or sometimes a slave master could just find it convenient to let their slave go. Most slave masters who chose that last option to free their slave for their own benefit were merchants who needed someone to be able to sign contracts on their behalf, and since slaves weren't allowed to represent their masters from a legal standpoint, they would be freed, but would still work for their master. You also had to be over the age of 30 to buy your freedom, so if you were lucky to live that long, then there was hope of being freed, but with the average life expectancy in ancient Rome being about 28 years or so, and with the living conditions of many slaves, they would be lucky to get that opportunity. At number 5, demand. In ancient Rome, there was an incredibly high demand for slaves, but since there were so many slaves in Rome, there was always work for them. Oftentimes, people sold themselves or their children into slavery in order to pay off their debts, so when it came to being bought, that came pretty easy. Other than public office, slaves were used for almost every activity in ancient Rome. The most common slave trade was mining because workers were always in demand, mostly due to the high level of danger that came with the job, and the fact that many slaves were injured or died while working in the mines, and slave masters needed to keep replacing those who could no longer work. Domestic labor and farming were also high demand jobs for slaves back then. Back then, the law logic behind using slave labor for these types of jobs was that, quote, free labor should be used in unhealthy places, end quote. Basically, they believed that it was better to have a slave pass away on the job than a free person because it would impact their business less. At number 4, procurement. The way that slaves were acquired in ancient Rome was pretty messed up, I will say. Typically, slaves were acquired through 4 different ways. They would be brought in as war captives, as victims of pirate raids, by trade, or by breeding. During the early expansion of the Roman Empire, many war captives were turned into slaves. The pirates from Sicilia, located in what is now modern-day Turkey, did business with the Romans and supplied them with a lot of their slaves. The pirates would bring their slaves to the island of Delos, which back then was considered to be the international center of slave trading. The slave trade was such a big deal back then that it has been recorded that on at least one occasion, 10,000 people were traded as slaves and shipped back to Italy in one day. This was a big business opportunity for a lot of people, but of course no one ever considered the lives of the people they were buying and selling.
Number 3, the brazen bull. This might be the oldest punishment on the books. It also may be the worst. Seriously, this one's the worst. Similar to boiling in oil, however, this is just much worse. The brazen bull, basically what you got here is a bull made of bronze, and she's hollowed out like one of those walker things from Star Wars with all the little stormtroopers in it. So you put the perpetrators inside, you lock them in, and then you start a fire underneath that would essentially cook your perps to well done. Make sure your perps are well oiled and salted. Keep on high heat until the screaming stops or the desired sin has been cooked away. Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine the horrible feeling that would be locked inside there. No amount of aloe vera could ever fix those burns. Number 2, dishonored burial. You are born, you live, and then you pass away. That's life. You gotta make the best of it. And at the very end, the least you can hope for is that the people will love you and give you the proper send-off that you deserve. This was a serious deal for those in the olden times. Every culture from every corner of the world has some sort of burial and ritual rites. However, imagine if you were the tribe's disgrace. Perhaps you ate all their food, or never contributed to the tribe. Maybe you're the reason why my favorite VHS tape went missing. Well, sir or madam, for your crimes and disrespect against this tribe, when you pass on, you will not receive the proper burial rites. There's been a few cases of remains dug up different from others, which begs the question, what did the person do to deserve such dishonors? And what did they do with my favorite VHS tape? Number 1, banishment. Hello darkness, my old friend. In the same way that most teenagers across the country feel when they discover hair dye, punk rock, and feelings, is probably the same way Neanderthals feel when they were banished from their homes. A simple plan really, non-violent but quite effective. As you walked along the boulevard of broken dreams, you'd be searching for a new home in the brutal, cold, and scary world that was ye olde times. Not even your offspring will know you, as you may never return. Besides, you're in too deep, and you're trying to keep yourself alive with anything that you can find. The all-American rejected teenagers do this kind of isolation from the comfort of their warm, isolated bedrooms that are paid for by loving parents. The Neanderthals were serious, as leaving the safety of your numbers had many disadvantages, not being eaten by a predator for one. Stay strong, kids. Stay strong. Number 10, Alcatraz. It's the 1930s and organized crime and gangsters have ruled over the city streets of America for at least a decade. At first, the crooks and wealthy gangsters were idolized for their lavish lifestyles and sticking it to the man attitude. Literally. A lot of these criminals are too wealthy and powerful to be caught, and all the smaller ones, well, they organize jailbreaks. A surprising amount, to be honest. Well, what if there was a place that was so inescapable, so dangerous, even for the most dangerous and lucrative criminal? Well, that's what Alcatraz was. A place for the most rotten, no-good criminals. And it was an example to others out there that Uncle Sam wasn't fooling around. Hence why Al Capone was sent there. And in case you were wondering, it wasn't a 5-star hotel. Surrounded by rough waters in San Francisco Bay, it was a fortress and a maximum security prison. Number 9, the Pillory. As an actor, my greatest fear would be an audience that's turned on me. And they've reached for their summer fresh ripe tomatoes and have launched them onto stage left where I am reciting Shakespeare monologues quite poorly. Maybe that was just a fever dream, but what isn't a fever dream is humiliating someone in a pillory. used back in ye olde times as a form of humiliation punishment, a means of exposing one to ridicule and embarrassment. Mind you, the design itself leaves you fairly vulnerable as both your head and arms are locked up in a not very comforting position. Something like this. It's not good. You don't like that. This is where the town can ridicule you. Name calling, spitting, slapping, and the aforementioned tomato toss. No thank you. I don't even like tomatoes. Not a big fan of tomatoes. Number 8. Tamashigiri, feudal Japan, a land of isolation, haikus, and cherry blossom trees in the divine wind. Speaking of divine wind, no, I'm just kidding. Oh, to be there and witness the art and majesty of the time. For me, and I'm sure a lot of others at home, the coolest part about feudal Japan is samurais, the knights for hire who became so powerful they basically became their own government. Pretty cool. While the samurai used a handful of different blades and tactics, none is more famous than the katana. Curved swords forged with great care and patience. The end result is a blade that's not only tough as steel, but can cut through just about any soft target. So after a blade was completed, it needed to be tested. Makes sense. The art of tamashigiri is taking criminals, crooks, and sadly oftentimes innocent folks and seeing how well a katana could lob off a limb. If it works, you have yourself a blade worthy of a Jedi. If not, well, back to the drawing board. No blood loss here. Well, actually a lot. Number 7. Stick. This should come as no surprise, but a lot of problems or punishments were probably dealt with in the almighty stick. Cheap, somewhat effective, and in good supply. There's tons of expression for who's got the bigger stick, but like General Shepard from Modern Warfare 2 said, it also depends on who's swinging it. We'll never really know who was the first human-like creature to pick up a stick and wave it, but what we do know is that sticks are a part of everyday life, like tools and hunting. The sticks can also make for an excellent punishment-delivering device. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but names can never hurt me. Well, maybe sometimes. Honestly, the only time I've ever been really hurt is when the world lost Harambe. Rest in peace, you silverback angel. Life's never been the same since. Number 6. Rock. And you smell what the Rock is cooking. Man, I miss the old Rock. I miss the WWE. Those were just good times, weren't they? Stone Cold too. What a great guy. Speaking of rocks. Probably the next best thing to a stick is a rock, probably even cheaper and more plentiful than sticks. All kinds of punishments can be derived from rocks. Simple techniques such as having the tribe fill baskets full of rocks and then throw them at you until you're seeing stars, or just ceasing to exist. Or in a similar situation, throwing someone off of a cliff, take a semi-large rock and drop it from a large height on top of somebody's head. Methods are different, however it usually ends up in the same results. Just wait till they find out what kind of minerals and ores are hiding in those rocks. Oh, the discovery of metal and metalworking. Number 5. Good soup. Perhaps we'll never know where any of these punishments truly come from, but like all things, they had to come from somewhere. Maybe they did come from Neanderthals. What I'm talking about here is boiling people alive in oil. The good old days, which honestly sounds like the worst way to go. It just can't be nice. A practice that yet again was done all over. Giving people the lobster treatment must have been the worst looking, the worst sounding, and the worst smelling way to unalive someone. I happen to be a lover of theater, but man, this is a little too much. It's hard to call this anything but theatrics, as I'm sure there were much easier ways to achieve certain goals. Honestly, you could probably cough on someone and would achieve the same result. Boy, am I thankful for sanitation. Number 4. Sacrifice. When your source of food gets taken away and then the rain doesn't stop for 6 days and 6 nights, and when your favorite VHS no longer works, it can truly only be an act of God. We have to please him. Set a bunch of ooga booga men around the campfire. But how do we do this? Well, that's usually when the quiet person in the back speaks up. Sacrifice someone to the gods, he says. Alright, sounds good to me. This was something that went on in many cultures around the world, but it makes you wonder who really was the first to try it. Or rather, keep trying it. I mean, hey, the buffalo came back, the rain stopped, and I just found my favorite VHS. Dude, we gotta sacrifice more people. Number 3, Vlad again? What? Yes, Vlad the Impaler again, and for an equally horrific sentence. Oh boy, here we go. There's a tale of two religious envoys making their way to Vlad's castle, past all the people on spikes and pikes and whatnot. Ooh, gross. Which he and the castle were inspirations for Dracula, remember, which is kinda cool, makes sense. And when these Gentiles got there and met Vlad, the first thing they were asked to do was remove their hats. Now, the kind depends on what version of the story is being told, but regardless, the religious men refused to remove their hats. So Vlad had his henchmen nail the hats into their skulls so that they may never remove them ever again. Oh my god, that is horrible. That's so bad. That's so bad. Number 2, molten metal. This one is straight out of Mortal Kombat, a traditional sentence that comes from the Middle East, Israel, and the Ottoman Empire. Basically, you take your perp and you restrain him so he cannot move from what Jigsaw-esque trap he's about to be unleashed upon. During this, the local blacksmith has been melting down some metals until they are in liquid form. Remember, there's 3 forms of matter: liquid, gas, and solids, remember that, and sometimes plasma, depends who you ask. Then, right from the crucible, the liquid hot magma is poured in the mouth of the crook. I will let you imagine how much pain and screaming it caused. It was a lot. Number 1, flaying. Did I say the last one was from Mortal Kombat? No, now see this one is one of Scorpion's best, I promised. A perpetrator is put on a table where, alive, this is done, and it's, oh god, I get lightheaded just thinking about it. The crook is slowly and precisely skinned like a big game hunt, and then they're left like a big red meaty surprise, kind of like the Titans look like an Attack on Titan. It's awful, don't do it, and we're better than that now.
Kicking off the list at number 10. Boiling. Whenever I get in a bath that's too hot, I think of the medieval times. I can't help it. I can't believe this was once a real thing. I get chills thinking about it. Either water or oil would be used for this ancient punishment. To die by being boiled, that was reserved for those who poisoned others. So if you have any vials of poison, toss it. Don't do it, man, trust me. In 1531, the time King Henry VIII was running the show, they made boiling a capital punishment. So poisoning somebody back then was equal to treason. Therefore, it was agreed you should be boiled slowly in front of like a room full of people. I would say that's the worst, but I know what's also to come on this list. Number 9. Water. Taking a step away from the worst physical thing one could possibly go through, let's take a look at how far the mind will go before it too breaks. Sensory deprivation is still around today. In fact, there's many who pay for it. Yeah, they lie in a dark tub full of salt, then they float and listen to Childish Gambino. It's a magical experience. Your senses are powerful, especially combined with water. So this dripping machine, this old water punishment, that was just all bad. You had ice cold water dripping on your forehead and your face over and over for hours and hours. Drops would be at different random times so you can predict it as well. My toes are wiggling while I'm talking about this. This is making me anxious right now. In medieval times, they would tie you down and then using a horn, a big ass funnel, they would pour 9 pints of water down your throat. So water is horrible in many ways. Number 8, fire. Can't talk about medieval punishments without mentioning this witchy classic. Commonly practiced in Babylonia and ancient Israel, then later on in Europe with the classic witch hunts, burning at the stake didn't come from churches, like many believe. They didn't call the shots there at all. That was mainly how small towns settled local beef. Yeah, by burning at the stake, instead of just like a fist fight at the park. Burning at the stake came in full swing way back in 1431 in France. French disbelievers like Joan of Arc, they were burned at the stake. It was crazy that they actually did this as a form of punishment. This is one of the worst medieval punishments, and believe me, there's a little bit of a silver lining here. It was quicker than most. Sometimes. Gunpowder was sometimes used so that the burning and stuff would be much faster, and brighter, and louder, and much more horrible. A lot worse on paper, but a lot faster, so honestly, I think it's better. History is insane. Another red hot punishment used in medieval times was when the accused had to hold a red hot iron bar and then walk a few steps with it. A red hot iron bar, your hands were literally toast at that point. Here's where it gets even worse though. 3 days later, the accused would come back to the court, and then when the bandages were removed, if their hands were healing, they started to heal, they were deemed innocent. They were on the path to goodness and whatever. If their hands were still in horrible condition from, say, I don't know, holding a red hot iron bar, then they were pronounced guilty. That's how the courts worked back then.
Number 7, electric chair. Ever seen The Green Mile? Yeah, I have a fear of electricity and sponges now too. The electric chair was a popular sentence in the early to mid 20th century for the truly awful and interesting members of our society. But after years of controversial use and horror, we no longer use it. Oh wait, just kidding, it's actually still used today. Now, I'm not here to make a statement on capital punishment, but imagine being in court and the judge looks at you and says, you know what? You look like you could use 2,000 volts at around 12 amps running through your body. Which, for all DIY electricians at home, is enough to make your self-wiring project your last. So, stay out of court. Number 6, Vlad the Impaler. You gotta love Vlad. Here you got a king and leader of a small European kingdom that is constantly being targeted by members of the previous dynasty who want him gone, and foreign invaders frothing at the mouth to take over his kingdom. Vlad, however, wasn't going to take any of this laying down. Vlad amassed his army and did his best to defend his kingdom. However, it's his horrible scare tactics that have him on this list, as anyone he caught that was thought to be an enemy of the state was impaled on a large wooden stake through the hindquarters. Ouch. And like the worst Christmas decoration ever, he left those poor saps on display for any who question his authority. There should be a field full of people on spikes. That's... oof. No thanks. Number 5, the National Razor. Once the National Razor had been busted out to get rid of King Louis and Marie Antoinette, well, it simply couldn't be put away. Like an ocarina song that you can't remember. That menu stays open for a while. Can't remember the songs. Now, when an autocratic leadership like the French monarch was, collapses, it creates a power vacuum. Plus, the country was starving and about to go to war, so they were trying times to say the least. So how do we quell the royalist movement and keep the revolution alive? Said Robespierre. I know. Let's bring out the National Razor on overdrive. Ooh, good idea. During a short time period, thousands of people met their end to the guillotine for anti-revolution behavior, right up until Robespierre also met his end the same way for anti-revolution behavior. But at that time, anything could be anti-revolution behavior, so a lot of people off of the head.
Number 3, rats. Another Game of Thrones classic. If you're a rat person, I know there's a lot of people who do tricks with their pet rat. That's cool, but maybe cover Stuart Little's eyes for this one. Rats as a medieval punishment, where do I even start? Okay, this one was a punishment for the rats at the same time. What was once called a rat trap involved a man or woman being tied down to something, and then a metal enclosure would be strapped down to their chest or their stomach. Now inside this metal enclosure, there's rats, which are also just loose walking around, and the person can feel them, the little feet walking around in their skin. And this is when the person instilled on the punishment begins heating the other end of the metal enclosure. Historically, it was hot coals that were usually placed on top, or there's a fire underneath, which quickly creates a hot environment for the rats inside. From there, the rats begin frantically searching for a way out, but because it's made of metal and they can't bite through that, they find your skin, and then that they can obviously bite through. So you can paint the picture in your head. It's disgusting. Number 2, the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel is literally just a large disc, a pirate ship wheel almost, just lying there, where somebody is then tied to it and everybody else just hammers them and beats the shit out of them over and over. But of course, since we're talking about medieval times, everything has to be a show and whatnot, so once the accused was beaten and then presumed dead, the wheel would lift up and turn just to show everybody what's up. Another way to use the breaking wheel, yep, there was more than one, again, creative folks back then, they would tie a person to the wheel and then continue to rotate it, and then all the ropes below would get tighter and twist. Kind of like the rack, but with a literal twist.
Number 10, Robert Rostango. This is a weird one. When I got to high school, cell phones and meme culture were already a mainstay in our culture. It wasn't in its infancy, but it was there. I was the first generation to have teachers tell us to put our phones away. By the time I got to senior year, smartphones were pretty much, well, like they are today. And there was a class full of rowdy teenagers more interested in planking than, what our anthro teacher had to say. Wasn't a big fan of my anthro teacher, she wasn't very nice. Constant buzzing, ringing, and popular girls walking in late to class with a bench handbag twice the size of our desks. Good times. Teachers need a raise. Well, Judge Robert Rostango in 2005 was already fed up with cell phones. And that's even way before we were arguing over if the dress was black and blue or white and gold. Remember that? I do. Judge Rostango was so fed up with phones in his court that he told everybody, if it goes off again and no one claims it, if it's not theirs, if it's yours, you're all going to jail. You're all going to be thrown in jail for contempt of court. After a cell phone did ring, he he wasn't bluffing as he threw everybody in jail for contempt of court. Mind you, they only stayed a couple hours and they were eventually released, the charges were dropped, and a few years later he was fired. So yeah, kind of a weird story, but wow, keep your cell phones off, you know, you go to jail. Number 9, Michael Cinconetti the first. This guy's pretty interesting. A judge from Ohio with creative creative punishments. For the first case of his creative punishment, it involved a local high school student who was fed up with something. What? I'm not sure, but it was probably a legit reason. Well, with his edgelord rage, he mowed an offensive abbreviation in the high school lawn. Kind of a weird thing to do. I don't know why you'd mow something offensive in the lawn, like, oh, I hate the system, I'm gonna mow their lawn. So when the crook was caught and brought before Judge Cinconetti, well, the young mischief maker wasn't ready. Instead of jail time or juvenile hall, he had the option, instead of going there, to mow the entire lawn of the high school with a manual push mower. It doesn't sound that bad, but if you've ever actually used a manual push mower before, then you know how labor intensive that could be. Lessons learned, I hope. They're not fun. After after a day of using it, you gotta take the blades off, sharpen them, you gotta oil. Oh, it's no good, no good. Number 8, Michael Cinconetti, the second part. Here we go. This guy's got a couple under his belt. It's pretty cool. Another youth in trouble of being sucked into the justice system of America. And there's Judge Cinconetti to save the day. In another case, a troubled youth had spray painted graffiti where graffiti shan't be. Truth be told, I think graffiti adds color to the city, especially downtown alleys. I mean, how am I supposed to know whose turf I'm on? Not that I could read it anyway. However, the youth was facing up to 10 days in jail, but instead Judge Cinconetti offered that the criminal Rembrandt use his talents for good. He was to paint an old beat up handrail black. Except he had to do it with a toothbrush instead of a paintbrush. Now, given my paint background, I'd say he got off pretty easily. The worst part would have been the fumes from the paint, but then again, even some folks enjoy that too, so I don't know. Wouldn't be that bad. You actually get a lot done. It's still a brush. It might be a small brush, but you still get a lot done.
Number 7, the rack. On to something not so hot and fast, but rather dull and slow, the rack is surprisingly well known. It was originally introduced to the Tower of London around 1420. The Duke of Exeter referred to this device as his daughter. What a weirdo. It's like guys who call their car like she. It's like, okay, just a little bit too close to your automobile, man. Relax. It was an open bed frame type device where your ankles were tied at the bottom and your hands were tied at the top. Already we're off to a horrible start. It was horizontal as well, and sometimes it was up. It was all bad. It would just leave you hanging by these ropes, and these ropes were slowly tightened more and more, obviously causing some problems to muscles and joints that were, holding things in place. This was done to extract information. This is also one of the worst things I've heard. Even getting tickled like this would be horrible. I couldn't even imagine. I make jokes because I'm uncomfortable. Honestly, hit that thumbs up to spread some good vibes because we're not even halfway done, folks. Number 6, molten metal. This was another form of capital punishment, and if you've seen Game of Thrones, it'll ring a familiar bell. A few of these do, actually. Yikes. Metal would be heated up in a cauldron for a long time to the point where it was liquid. It was molten metal, just a soup of minerals. Look, we said this video wasn't for the faint-hearted, and here at Bumblebee, we like to keep that promise. They would then pour the molten metal on your head, or more commonly known, they pour it down the throat of the accused. Obviously, it wasn't done as a method to extract information, it was done to brutally end someone's life. Because they're not talking after that, of course. Execution by molten metal was supposedly done to a wealthy Roman general, Marcus Licinius Crassus, back in ancient times. The metal would burn your muscles and skin, literally cooking it, and then after a few moments, it would harden. Bad, not good. Number 5. Keel hauling. Not to be confused with Kegels, keel hauling was reserved for the worst of the worst at sea. This was used by pirates for sailors who disobeyed orders and all that jazz. The victim would be suspended by a rope with rocks or weights around their ankles, then they're lowered to the keel of the ship where all the sharp barnacles live. After so long, these ships are so old, it's just piled on layers and layers of barnacles. Then they would get dragged all along them with the water and everything. Water plus pain, it's a lot. It's a deadly combination. Anything to do with barnacles in the sea, no chance. I'll literally tell you anything, Blackbeard. Anything. Number 4, solitary confinement. This is a kind of punishment that still exists in our modern society, but it can truly be one of the worst punishments out there because of the type of psychological distress that it causes. We were all just in a pandemic for so long. We got so bored and we had Netflix and iPads and whatevers. I can't even imagine this back in the day. Basically, it's a prisoner living in a single cell with little to no contact with anybody else. Not even like a guard or anything rattling keys like in the old times. It was just nothing. No one would even check on them. There are many stories about people being locked up for so long they forget about their families, and some people have gone away to solitary confinement for so long that once they're out, they just forget how to speak, really. They forget how to be a human and interact in the real world. Solitary confinement and the negative effects that it has on a person is becoming a wider topic of conversation because of the effects on a person's mental well-being, and it's a topic for a lot of human rights organizations. Back in medieval times, solitary confinement was literally just a room made of stones. It was pitch black, freezing cold, you were tucked away below some janky castle, and most of the time you weren't really alone. In the dark, nibbling away at your little piggies were
Number 3, hip hop and Bach. There's really nothing worse than a neighbor who's too loud, especially for their own good. You can go house searching in this market, look all over, and finally find the right place. Ooh, too bad your neighbor's a metalhead and doesn't care about the bylaws. Uh-oh. Listen, I can jam to Metallica all day, but it is best to respect those around you, just the way I feel. Well, Andrew Factor was that neighbor, and after finding himself in court, he was facing a $150 fine. Or he had the option to listen to classical music for 20 hours and pay only $35. He got about 15 minutes into Bach before he got up and decided to pay the $150 fine. He said he was late to band practice, but in actuality it was more of he didn't want to listen to the music, which he was doing because he was loud and making people listen to music that they didn't want to listen to. It's, how the tables have turned. Number 2, Ash Tower. This one's from ancient Persia. So basically, you get a large wooden tower, say about 3 stories. And on the inside, you get yourself a nice fire going. Nice big fire going. You let it burn for a couple of days to create a nice pile of ash. Now, you just need a perpetrator to toss in there. As if that weren't enough, the tower has a wheel and a pole in the center that allows an operator on the outside to stir you up like a cake batter from hell. Thus, your punishment would be to spend time in a swirling dust storm of hot fire, ash, and horribleness. God, that sounds awful. Oof, no thanks. And number 1, milk and honey. This one's just so diabolical. I can't even. Even James Bond villains are saying, oh, that's a bit much, isn't it? And the chief, well, you know what the chief said. He said that's not it. A very unique punishment from, again, ancient Persia. It goes as follows. You take your perpetrator and you tie him down to a boat so both arms and legs are bound, something like that. Then you come by every day to a boat that's hovering near the shore and force feed the crook milk and honey until they cannot take it anymore. It often leads to a boat full of refunded lunch, human waste, or even sometimes a crocodile might come by for some free lunch, brought to you by the judicial system of ancient Persia. Ooh, no thank you. No thanks.
At number 10, population. It's pretty messed up just how many slaves there were in ancient Rome. In their society, wealthy people owned dozens, if not hundreds of slaves to do their menial work. In ancient Rome, anyone could be sold into slavery. No matter your race or background, if you could work, you could be bought and sold. Historians believe that about 90% of the free people in Italy by the 1st century BCE had ancestors who were slaves. At one point, the Roman Senate debated having slaves wear uniforms to be able to distinguish them from the rest of society, but they ultimately decided against it when they realized just how many slaves there were. One ancient Roman politician once said, quote, "It was once proposed in the Senate that slaves should be distinguished from free people by their dress, but then it was realized how great a danger this would be if our slaves began to count us." End quote. They literally couldn't afford to let the slaves know how many other slaves there were, because if they would have known they outnumbered the other members of society, this could have led to a revolt. I mean, there were slave revolts regardless, but we will get to that later. At number 9, lifestyle. Ancient Roman slaves experienced different lifestyles and living conditions based on a number of factors, often linked to their occupations. Slaves who didn't have a specific skill or trade were often used in mines and agriculture, and those were the harshest conditions that they could have been subjected to. Oftentimes, they were literally worked to death, and since they didn't have any human rights in the eyes of the Romans, they were often overlooked and simply replaced. On the other hand, household slaves received more humane treatment. They were treated better by their masters, and sometimes they were able to get some money in order to buy their freedom. If they were able to buy their freedom, the slaves would become freedmen, which was a social class between slaves and free people. Before we continue discussing the hard lives of slaves in ancient Rome, make sure you guys smash that thumbs up button if you're thoroughly entertained so far, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Spartacus. At one point, a group of Roman slaves revolted, and though they eventually lost their battle, they survived a pretty long time thanks to one famous slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who escaped a gladiatorial training camp and recruited thousands of other slaves to fight for their freedom alongside him. For the slaves, Spartacus was their symbol of hope and their leader. This slave army was able to defy Roman authorities for 2 years with freedom in their sights, but unfortunately those dreams were crushed when Roman general Crassus crushed Spartacus and his army. After Spartacus was killed, the authorities came for the rest of the slaves in the army and they were severely punished. 6,000 slaves who took part in the revolt were crucified, and this was almost a warning to the other slaves against trying to revolt again. Spartacus became a legend, but it wasn't enough to free the Roman slaves.
Number 7. Michael Cinquenetti III. Part 3 on this guy. This guy's crazy. Last time I talked about Judge Cinquenetti on this list, but I think this is the best one actually. This is pretty crazy. Look, sometimes youths get themselves into trouble for a whole slew of reasons. I'm sure even you guys at home agree that, you know, we all make mistakes when we're young. Everyone has. Well, this one's about someone who is all grown up now. A woman who skipped out on a cab fare. Oh, she needed the money for a new pair of shoes because when she was brought to Cinquenetti's court, her sentence was to walk 30 miles in 48 hours. Yikes! For Canadian fans out there, that's like walking from Toronto to Newmarket. Oh, no thank you. Yeah, I know, right? That's the worst. But to be fair, she did ride and dash, so always pay your due, folks. I don't know. Otherwise, you'll be walking. You'll be doing the Terry Fox run, buddy. You're out. That'd be the worst one for me, dude. Are you kidding me? It's like, listen, we know you're gonna walk. No! Number 6, tough love. It's Friday night. The glow of 2 PC monitors illuminates your face. An ice cold Monster energy drink has just hit your empty stomach. Good thing you can order chicken mac nuggets right at your house. Living in your mom's basement is great, except when other gamers call you out for being a sweat and you really have no comeback because you are living in your mom's basement, so it's kind of tough. Yes, the life of millennial mid-20s who didn't move out of their parents' houses. Oh, Mom, I can't pause the game right now. It's an online match. God! Well, how about this case from Andalusia, Spain, where a 25-year-old man was taking his parents to court because they cut off his allowance. Yeah, question, who's still getting allowance at 25? I'm 25, someone give me allowance? I like allowance. Give me allowance. Ugh, worst! Well, seeing as this was completely ludicrous, the judge not only sided with the parents, but actually forced him on court order to move out of their parents' house and get a job. You thought it was gonna go your way, but now who's the clown? The sweaty guy in the basement. Number 5, penalty of the sack. Man, this one is just so brutal. Here's one from ancient Rome because we gotta mix it up a little bit. Some modern, some from the past. Here we go. I would not wish this upon my worst enemy. So once found of a worse enough crime to deserve this, you would be placed in a large leather sack. But because Romans are super nice and don't want you to be lonely, they give you some pets to keep you company. Also placed in the sack with you is a chicken, a dog, a monkey, and a snake. Wow, that sounds like quite the party. You might get a little thirsty in there having so much fun, so then the animal squad entourage in you is thrown into a body of fast-moving water just to cool off. How nice. All jokes aside, this is a horrible and brutal method that has several animal agencies looking for a time machine just to talk to the Romans and ask them, hey man, not cool, you know? That's crazy. I can't even imagine that. Have you ever been whitewater rafting before? That's that plus a monkey and a snake? Oh, I don't like that. Number 4, Xmas Slammer Blues. Nobody wants their Christmas to get ruined. Even the people that say they hate Christmas. How can you say no to a gift? I know I can. I love gifts. Well, Bettina Young, a woman from Ohio, knows what it's like to have her Christmas ruined. Young had been involved in a driver's license scandal, which, given some drivers on the road today, makes a lot of sense where they got their license from. I don't know. Well, her sentence was very unusual to say the least. She was to spend 5 Christmases in jail. No, not 5 literal years as Christmases. What they actually mean is she was to spend 5 Christmases in jail, meaning all the other days of the year she would be free, on probation of course, but come Christmas time she wouldn't be cutting turkey, she would be in jail away from her family thinking about what she has done. That's kind of weird though. It's like, hey guys, I'll see you after Christmas, I gotta go. Where are you going? I'm going to jail. I'm just gonna spend a weekend in jail, you know, I'm just gonna spend a weekend in jail. No big deal.
At number 3, fugitives. As you can imagine, life as a slave in ancient Rome or at any period of time wasn't easy. Living conditions were poor, it was dangerous, and no one should ever be treated like that or used for free labor. Many slaves have been known to escape, and obviously the same went for those in ancient Rome. Slaves running away from their masters was a common thing back then, and to deal with it, slave owners would hire professional slave catchers to hunt down, capture, and return the escaped slave back to their owner. For slave owners who wanted to take matters into their own hands, they would advertise rewards for those who could return their slaves, or they would just try and locate their slave themselves. Some slave owners had ways of preventing their slaves from getting away, like using collars with instructions on where to return the escaped slave, much like a dog collar, which is just dehumanizing. At number 2, revolts. In Roman times, slave revolts were pretty common. There have been a number of recorded slave revolts in Roman history. I mentioned the one that was led by Spartacus, but there's another pretty famous Roman slave revolt that was led by a man named Eunice. Eunice led a revolt that happened in Sicily from 135 to 132 BCE. It is said that Eunice believed himself to be a prophet and claimed to have several mystical visions. Eunice was able to persuade a number of other slaves to follow him when he performed a trick where sparks and flames came out of his mouth. They believed that he was magical, and so they followed him to try and fight back against the Roman forces. Unfortunately, they were defeated, but the example that they set is believed to have inspired yet another slave revolt in Sicily later in 104 to 103 BCE. And finally, at number 1, totally normal. Probably the most messed up thing about life as a Roman slave was just how normal slavery was in society. I mean, the Roman people were so invested in their slaves that they continuously tried to crush their revolts, and they tried everything in their power to keep them from escaping. Even the sheer number of slaves that were in their society just shows how important slavery was to them. Back then, slavery was just an unquestioned institution. For many, it was just a normal part of life, which is actually quite frightening when you think about it. There is no recorded history of Romans ever questioning slavery in their society, and all economic, legal, and social forces in Rome at this time worked hard to try and preserve slavery as part of their society. To the ancient Romans, slaves were seen as the direct opposite of free people, which they believed was a necessary balance that they needed in their society. They never completely got rid of slavery either. Though they did try and create new rules and laws to make life as a slave more bearable, they were still bought and sold into servitude and were seen as property and lesser people.